Left wing bottom skin is complete. Spent most of the day getting everything squared away with the bottom skin. Pretty happy with the way that went. Everything lined up nice and tight. Look down on the seams. Took a little bit of extra effort to work on the drop tank and tie down holes, but once I got that figured out, there's a really awesome little trick that Brian showed me to use, which worked really well. The bottom ones are a little bigger than I would have liked to, but I figured it out, and by the top ones, they end up pretty good. So now I'm going to move on to the right wing. Right wing bottom skin installation. A couple things I learned on the left wing. Spent a lot of time doing some things I didn't need to do. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find center of each of the D-spar, of the stringer, and then of the aft spar. I'll run figure out half of those. I'm only going to mark those on the ribs. There's no reason to mark it all the way across because I can't see that anyways. And I marked the inside on the left wing so I could confirm, but ultimately just looking at it, once I saw the lines, they were nice and straight, so I'm not going to spend time doing that on this wing. So I'm hoping the right wing will go a lot faster than the left wing. So I'm going to go through and find half on basically a ½ inch up or close to halfway through each of these on the way through. So, and I'll mark those on each of the spars, or on each of the ribs. And then what I did is I ended up drilling these from the top. The trick that they had talked about using was drilling from the inside, which I do, but not at the beginning because it gives me a much straighter drill and a pilot hole to use if I drill it from the outside. All right, so they are all marked. And the next step is to do a center punch on each one. Working on the bottom skin layout. So one thing that you have to do is on the flat brackets, all of your starting marks are measured off the stringer. So it's a 1.5 inches down and 1.5 inches up from the center line of the stringer. So once you lay that line of rivets or of holes and clecos in for rivets, this is angled down, and so you go 1.5 inches off the center line, top and bottom, and that's how you measure, not from the bottom, from the leading edge of the wing back, you go from the stringer. And that gives you the proper spacing to make sure you don't put holes anywhere you shouldn't. So in this case, what I've done is I've marked that halfway mark on here that's going to match my holes I've already center punched. I've measured on this, at least this section, I've measured up 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches. That allows me to put a pilot hole in from the front, so that when I drill from the inside, when I put my marking hole in, these will be pretty close. On my other wing, when I did this on the top side, my rivets are off a little bit, so it's gonna be a flaw. You're gonna see that a straight rivet line, and there's gonna be 2 rivets that are off a little bit on the flaps on the top. On the bottom, which is where nobody's gonna see it, I figured out the way to do that. top ones are the same. These are actually on that center line on the top. Those are marked, and they'll be drilled from the outside in, so with a pilot hole. So they'll be exactly in line and look nice and straight all the way through. So I'm going to measure this one here. I've got center line marked on the bottom on the stringer, and then I've got vertical center lines for the flanges. So basically just throw up a measuring tape or a ruler in this case, go 1.5 inches. All my holes for my pilot holes drilled, or at least center punched. So now it's time to drill all those. So center punched all my marks. I'll drill a pilot hole with a number 50 drill bit on each of the centers of the spars and the stringer. That allows for me to come from the inside with that larger drill bit, the 40, which is what the Clecos use. So the 50 just allows me to make sure it's a fine point all the way through, gives me a pilot hole as a guide on the back side. And I'll use that 50, and then I'll use the 40 on the other side. So for those that are watching, I'm making sure that my fingers are below, just because these flex a little bit. I'm just making sure I have a little bit of pressure on the back as I go through to make sure it's a straight hole. I am making sure my fingers are clear so that I don't go through and drill my finger. All right, so all the pilot holes are drilled. Next thing to do is going to be to lay the skin up. It's set in place. Have tape down the bottom to help do that. Make sure it's lined up on the outboard end. Trick here is to lift it straight up. The skin sheet sits right on that lip, and the tape holds it. I just wanna make you mine, mine. I just wanna make you mine, mine. I just wanna make you mine. There's a little bit of glue on that end right there at the seam, and this spot right here where I think that's probably some glue. So I'll take this skin off. Once I have the skin off, I'll actually make a couple of marks here so that when I'm putting it back on and off, I know where that's at until I at least get a couple Clecos in. And that way I don't have to fight the end as much as I did this time. I'll clean that up with some acetone and a razor knife to make sure that all sits nice and flush. And then I'll start working on notching the skin for the flap brackets, and that's the first step. The slots for the flat mounting brackets can be cut out with measurements, but in this case I wanted a nice tight fit to make sure that it was exactly correct for the actual wing. And so in this case I used the blue tape to mark the edges and went a little bit tighter than the actual measurement showed, just a little bit wider than the actual thickness of the bracket. and what I'm doing is just cutting up to the edge of the tape, which is the line that I wanted to cut on, and I'm switching back and forth between the two brackets because I'm trying to minimize the bow that's caused by the brackets as I lay them in tight. Using the tape over the top of the wing and the top of the skin there to just pull it tighter to keep it snug as I make the cuts down. Here you can see the blue tape that I used to mark the edges of the flap brackets and allowed me to use my cutoff disc to do the thickness. I also put marks on there for height, so I could cut down 3 or 4 marks and then go from the inboard to the outboard flap brackets and allow the skin to lay flat. And then I had that bottom mark keeping me from going too far down, so I just had a good gauge of where I was. Here we can see the joy of editing after the fact. My microphone stopped working, so all of the wisdom that I'm sharing at this point in time wasn't recorded. So essentially what I'm showing here is that by cutting both the inboard and outboard brackets and then using that tape on top to pull the skin tight, I can see exactly how the skin's going to lay in against the flap bracket, and that allows me to clean it up so that I get a nice tight fit without taking too much material out and minimize any kind of bowing that comes from the surface. And then I cleaned up those sections. Right wing bottom skin is in place. Have the slots cleaned up, rounded out the bottoms, filed off the edges so they're nice and clean and straight, so everything lays nice and flush. It's time to start putting the rivets in or drilling the holes to put the clecos in for the rivet spots. So